The final nail in the coffin of Ilara's old life was not driven by a hammer, but by the dry scrape of her brother-in-law's pen. Josiah, a man whose piety was as thin as his lips, sat behind her late husband's desk, the wood still holding the faint scent of Thomas and sawdust. He pushed a piece of paper across the polished surface. It was a ledger of debts, meticulously recorded, each entry a small betrayal. Thomas, it seemed, had borrowed against the farm from his own brother, a fact he had carried to his grave like a stone in his pocket. The farm, the house, the livestock, it all settles the account, Josiah stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. He was an elder in the Church of Providence Gulch, a town that prized prosperity as proof of divine favor. A widow's destitution, therefore, was her own failing. He slid a small, heavy purse across the desk. The clink of the coins was obscene in the quiet room. This is what remains. $20. A gesture of Christian charity. Ilara did not reach for it. Her hands, calloused from a life of work beside Thomas, lay still in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the window, where the autumn sky was the color of slate. She had buried her husband 3 days prior. The town had come, offered their condolences and their casseroles, and then they had vanished, leaving her to the mercy of a man who possessed none. There is also the matter of the deed, Josiah continued, producing a second, more weathered document. Thomas bought it years ago, a foolish speculation, but it is in his name. Therefore, it is yours. He unfurled it. It was a small, oblong plot of land marked 3 miles downriver. It was known to everyone in the gulch as the Slip. It was not land so much as a geological error, a steep, crumbling embankment of clay and loose rock that was actively sliding into the fast, cold water of the Promise Creek. It was worthless. It was an insult. The community had already rendered its verdict. When she walked to the mercantile the next morning, the purse heavy in her pocket, the whispers followed her like stray dogs. Mr. Gable, the proprietor, polished a glass jar with a clean cloth, his expression a careful mixture of pity and disapproval. $20 will get you a stagecoach ticket east, missus, he offered, his voice low. No shame in it. Go back to your people. My people are here, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Her family was dust in a churchyard 2 states away. Thomas had been her people. Their farm had been her home. Now all she had was a grave to visit and a deed to a landslide. There's nothing for you here, Ilara, Gable pressed, his kindness a smothering blanket. That land, it's a death sentence. The winter winds off that creek will cut a soul in 2. She did not argue. She did not explain the cold, hard knot of refusal that had formed in her gut. To accept charity was to accept their judgment, that she was helpless, a problem to be solved and sent away. To leave was to let Josiah win, to let Thomas's memory be erased by a ledger book. She would not. She looked at the tools hanging on the wall. Her gaze settled on a new shovel head, its edge keen and sharp, and a broad felling axe, its handle smooth and unblemished. I'll need the axe, she said, and the shovel head, a bag of salt, 10 pounds of flour, and all the twine you can spare. Mr. Gable stopped polishing the jar. He stared at her as if she had announced her intention to fly. The other patrons in the store fell silent. The purchase was an act of defiance, a declaration of intent so foolish it bordered on madness. He weighed out the goods, his movements slow and deliberate. When he handed her the change, there were only a few coins left. Not enough for a stagecoach ticket, not enough for anything but the life she was about to choose. She walked out of the store, the heavy axe balanced on one shoulder, the supplies in a sack on the other. She did not look back. She walked past the church where Josiah preached of mercy, past the farm where she had planted her life, and toward the winding path that led down to the river. Behind her, the town of Providence Gulch watched her go, convinced they were watching a woman walk to her own grave. The journey to the slip was a descent into a wilder, colder world. The manicured fields of the gulch gave way to tangled woods, and then to the rocky, wind-scoured floodplain of the Promise Creek. The path dissolved into a game trail, forcing her to push through brittle, leafless branches that clawed at her coat. The weight of the axe and the sack of supplies settled deep into her bones, a constant, aching reminder of the task ahead. Her only companion was the silence, broken by the rush of the river and the caw of a lone crow circling overhead. She walked for hours until the sun was a pale wafer in the afternoon sky, and the cold had seeped through her worn boots. Finally the trees thinned, and she stood at the edge of the plot marked on her deed. It was worse than she had imagined. It was a scar on the face of the earth. A sheer cliff of mud, clay, and jutting rock fell away 30 feet to the churning river below. The wind, channeled by the valley, hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. There was no flat ground, no shelter, nothing but a raw, unstable precipice. This was the moment of despair. It washed over her, cold and vast as the river itself. Mr. Gable was right. The town was right. Josiah was right. This was not a place to live. It was a place to die. Her knees felt weak, and she had to brace herself against a skeletal poplar tree to keep from falling. The wind howled in her ears, a mocking laugh. Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. For a long, hollow moment, she saw the future they had all predicted. Her bones picked clean by crows at the bottom of the crumbling slope. The sheer, bitter injustice of it all threatened to break her. But then the wind gusted with such ferocity that it nearly tore her from the tree. Seeking any respite, she slid down the base of the trunk and pressed herself against the exposed face of the embankment. And in that small act of survival, she felt it. The wind stopped, not lessened, but stopped. The air right against the cliff face was perfectly still. The roaring in her ears subsided to a distant rush. It was a pocket of profound calm in the heart of the gale. Curiosity, a flicker of the spirit she thought had been extinguished, stirred within her. She pressed her bare palm against the wall of earth. It was cold, but it was a damp cellar cold, not the biting crystalline frost of the exposed ground at her feet. There was a different quality to it, a deep, resonant solidity. She scraped at the surface with her fingernails, pulling away loose soil and pebbles. Beneath it, she found a layer of dense, heavy clay, the color of a stormy sky. It was smooth and pliable, holding the faint, deep chill of the earth, not the sharp cold of the air. Her eyes scanned the cliff face. About 10 feet away, near the base, she saw a dark, wet stain on the rock. A thin, almost imperceptible trickle of water wept from a fissure, snaking its way down to the river. It wasn't a gushing spring, but it was constant. It was water, clean, clear, and year-round. The pieces clicked into place in her mind, not as a grand vision, but as a series of simple, brutal facts. The earth itself was a wall against the wind. The deep earth held a steady temperature, a shield against the killing cold of winter and the baking heat of summer. The clay was a building material, the same kind of daub her grandmother had used to chink the gaps in their old cabin. And the seep was life. It was all here. The town saw a worthless, crumbling cliff. She now saw 3 solid walls and a roof, waiting to be dug out of the earth. The despair did not vanish, but it receded, replaced by a grim, formidable resolve. This place was not her grave. It would be her home. The first day was an act of pure, punishing labor. She fitted the new head to the shovel handle she'd salvaged from the farm, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. She chose a spot near the water seep, where a slight concavity in the bank already existed. Then she began to dig. The work was a brutal rhythm of thrust, lift, and throw. The loose topsoil and gravel came away easily, tumbling down the slope into the greedy river, which carried it away like an accomplice. But soon her shovel struck the dense blue-gray clay, and the work became a battle. each shovelful was heavy, wet, and reluctant to leave the earth. Her shoulders screamed, the muscles in her back burned with a fire that grew with every swing. Within an hour, blisters had risen on her palms, soft and tender. Within 2, they had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin that stung with every contact on the wooden handle. She ignored the pain. She wrapped strips of cloth torn from her petticoat around her hands and kept digging. She was not just digging a hole. She was carving a space for her life out of the world that had cast her out. By nightfall, she had excavated a hollow barely large enough to curl up in, a shallow cave that offered minimal protection from the elements. She ate a piece of dry bread, her hands shaking with exhaustion, and huddled deep inside the opening, pulling her coat tight. The cold was still intense, but the wind could not reach her. She fell into a sleep so deep it was like a small death, her body aching in ways she had never known. The next day she began to think not just of shelter, but of structure. The river, her accomplice in excavation, became her supplier. It had carried fallen trees down from the high country, leaving them stranded in the shallows and on the banks. Using the last of her twine, she fashioned a crude harness and began the back-breaking work of dragging timber up the slope. The logs were waterlogged and impossibly heavy. She strained and slipped, her boots finding little purchase on the slick clay. More than once a log escaped her grasp and rolled back into the water, undoing an hour of torturous effort. But she persisted. She was building a facade, a fourth wall to seal the opening of her dugout. She dug footings for the main vertical posts, sinking them deep into the ground. Using the sharp new axe, Thomas had always kept his tools perfectly honed. She learned to cut notches, fitting the logs together in a crude but solid frame. The sound of the axe echoed in the silent valley, a lonely proclamation of her existence. She had no nails, no pegs. She used the land itself. She dug up the tough, fibrous roots of the scrub willows growing along the bank, soaked them in the river until they were pliable, and used them to lash the joints of her log frame together. Between the logs, she began the painstaking process of chinking. She hauled buckets of the blue clay, mixing it with river sand and dried grasses she gathered from a meadow upstream. She packed the mixture into every gap and crevice with her raw hands, the cool mud a strange balm on her blisters. The clay wall grew, inch by painstaking inch, a solid barrier between her and the world. She left a small opening for a door and a smaller one, higher up, for a window. Her greatest challenge was fire. A shelter without heat was just a colder tomb. She needed a hearth and a chimney. Building a fireplace from river stones was simple enough, but venting the smoke without it filling her small space and killing her was another matter. For days she studied the cliff face. She noticed a thin, deep fissure in the rock, running vertically up from about 4 feet above the floor of her dugout. It was a long shot, but she scrambled up the slippery bank and dropped a small pebble into the crack. A few seconds later, she heard it clatter out onto a ledge far above. It was a natural flue. With renewed determination, she built her hearth at the base of the fissure, using the thickest, flattest river stones she could carry. She mortared them together with her clay mixture, building a solid, safe firebox that directed its heat into the room and its smoke into the crevice. The first time she lit a fire, her heart was in her throat. She used the last of her matches to ignite a small bundle of dry tinder. Smoke billowed for a terrifying moment, and then, as if by a miracle, it was drawn upward, disappearing into the rock. It worked. The fire caught, and a wave of warmth, the first real warmth she had felt in weeks, pushed back the damp chill of the earth. She sat before the small, dancing flames and wept, not from sorrow, but from a profound, aching sense of triumph. The shelter was functional, but her supplies were dwindling. Survival required more than just walls and a fire. It required systems. Her first system was for water. She used her shovel to carefully carve a narrow channel from the seep in the rock, directing the trickle along the interior wall of her dugout. At the end of the channel, she excavated a deep basin which she meticulously lined with a thick layer of pure clay, packing it down until it was smooth and waterproof. The seep slowly filled the basin, creating a small, clean cistern of fresh water right inside her home. She no longer had to risk the treacherous path to the river. With her last few dollars, she knew she had to make one more trip to Providence Gulch. The walk back to town felt different. She was no longer a grieving widow fleeing injustice. She was a builder, a planner, her mind occupied with calculations of need and resource. When she walked into Gable's Mercantile, the silence was immediate and heavy. She was thinner, her face etched with exhaustion, her hands scarred and calloused, but her eyes held a new light. They did not see a victim. They saw someone they could not comprehend. "I need 3 laying hens," she said, her voice clear, "and a sack of potatoes and carrots, and if you have any, seeds for winter greens." Mr. Gable stared at her hands, at the clay caked under her nails. He could not hide his astonishment. "Hens? Alara, where in God's name would you keep chickens?" "In my house," she said simply. The absurdity of her statement hung in the air. A woman living in a mudslide was buying chickens. Josiah, who had been speaking with another elder at the back of the store, strode forward. A cruel smirk played on his lips. "Still playing at survival, sister-in-law? I trust the accommodations at the slip are to your liking?" "They are mine," she answered, meeting his gaze without flinching. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Enjoy your chickens. The coyotes will eat well this winter." She paid for her goods, including a small wooden crate for the hens. The journey back was even more difficult than the first. She carried the heavy sack of vegetables and a crate of clucking, protesting chickens. The birds were a precious, fragile investment. She could not afford to lose them. When she finally reached her dugout, she was bone-weary but triumphant. Inside her home, she had already prepared for them. In a small alcove she had dug out of the side wall, she built a secure, warm coop from woven willow branches and packed clay. It was close to the hearth, ensuring the birds would not freeze. Their body heat, she knew, would add a small but constant source of warmth to the dugout. Their eggs would be a vital source of protein. They were another system, another strand in the web of survival she was weaving in the dark earth. She had shelter, she had water, she had heat, and now she had a source of food. She was utterly alone, but for the first time since Thomas's death, she was not helpless. She was the sovereign of her small, warm kingdom of mud and stone. The town of Providence Gulch, having decided Alara was mad, settled on a name for her. Josiah started it, a casual, cruel remark after a Sunday service. He called her the Cave Girl, and the name stuck, passed around with pitying shakes of the head and scornful chuckles. It painted a picture of a primitive, half-wild creature confirming their belief that she was doomed. The name was a weapon meant to strip her of her dignity and her past, reducing her to the worthless land she inhabited. One afternoon a trapper named Brant, a man known for his arrogance and rugged self-assurance, made his way down the river to check his lines. He saw the thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from the fissure high up the cliff face and came to investigate. He found Alara splitting firewood with a practiced, powerful swing of her axe. He stood there for a long moment, taking in the log facade, the tightly chinked walls, and the solid-looking door. He did not look impressed. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "The cave girl herself. Heard you were digging a hole to hide in. Didn't figure you'd get this far." He kicked at one of the foundation logs with his boot. "This won't last the winter. The frost will heave it right out of the ground, and the first big melt will wash this whole pathetic little project into the creek." Alara simply continued her work, splitting another round of wood with a clean crack. She did not grant him the satisfaction of a reply. "You're a fool, woman," Brant said, his voice rising as her silence unnerved him. You'll die in that hole. When they find your frozen body come spring, don't say Brant didn't warn you." He spat on the ground and stalked off, disappearing back into the trees, his laughter echoing faintly behind him. His visit solidified her isolation. She was a ghost to Providence Gulch, a cautionary tale whispered by the fire. But as the days grew shorter and the air sharpened with the promise of deep winter, her life settled into a rhythm that had no room for loneliness or fear. It was a life of constant, meaningful work. Her world shrank to the interior of her dugout, a space of warmth and order carved from the chaos outside. Her days began in darkness. She would wake to the soft glow of embers in the hearth and the gentle clucking of the hens in their coop. Her first task was always the fire. She would add kindling and then larger logs from the neat stack that lined one entire wall of her home, a bulwark of fuel that she had spent weeks cutting and hauling. With the fire roaring back to life, warmth would begin to seep back into the stones and the packed earth walls. Next, she tended her animals. She would give the chickens their small ration of grain and check for eggs, each one a perfect, precious treasure. She would talk to them softly, her voice the only human sound in the vast silence. Then she would check her water cistern, the calm, dark pool fed by the tireless seep. The heart of her winter world was a small miracle she had engineered near the hearth. In a long, deep box she had built from scavenged planks and filled with rich soil hauled from the woods, she had planted her seeds. Warmed by the constant radiant heat from the fireplace, a small, defiant patch of green grew in the subterranean twilight. Kale and hardy lettuce pushed their leaves toward the firelight. It was more than food, it was life, a protest against the barren, frozen world outside. Before the first heavy snow, a smaller storm came, a test of her systems. Rain fell for 2 days, turning the world to mud. She watched with anxiety as water sheeted down the cliff face, but her facade, protected by a slight overhang she had left, remained dry. The clay and log walls shed the water perfectly. The real test was the chimney. The fissure worked, but the driving rain threatened to pour down it and extinguish her fire. She solved the problem by finding a large flat stone and propping it over the opening of the fissure high on the bank, creating a small roof that kept the rain out while still allowing the smoke to escape. Another night, a wolf pack, driven by hunger, followed the river down from the high country. Their howls echoed through the valley, a sound that would have terrified anyone in a drafty cabin. Ilara sat by her fire, the heavy wooden bar secured across her door, and felt a profound sense of security. The wolves could not claw through packed earth and stone. They were creatures of the outside world, and she was no longer part of it. The solid walls of her home held the warmth in and kept the wildness out. She was not a primitive creature hiding in a hole. She was the keeper of a fortress. The great blizzard did not arrive like a storm. It arrived like an invading army. It began with a sky that turned the color of a bruise, a strange, yellow-gray light that seemed to suck all the warmth from the world. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell utterly silent. An unnatural stillness descended on the valley, a deep-held breath before a scream. Ilara felt it in her bones. She brought in her last load of firewood, checked the security of her door, and gave the chickens an extra ration of feed. Then the wind came back, not as a whisper, but as a solid wall of sound, a physical force that made the very earth tremble. It was a high, shrieking roar, filled with the sound of ice and fury. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding white torrent that erased the world. The temperature plummeted. It was a cold that felt ancient and malevolent, a cold that sought out every crack and crevice, a cold that killed. Inside her dugout, Ilara was in another world. The roar of the wind was a dull, distant thunder, muted by feet of solid earth. Her fire burned steadily in the hearth, its orange light painting the clay walls with warmth. The air was cool but still, the temperature holding steady in a way no wooden cabin ever could. The massive thermal mass of the earth around her was her greatest shield. It absorbed the deep cold of the surface, refusing to let the frost penetrate. She stoked the fire, drank hot tea made from pine needles, and listened to the storm trying to tear the world apart. Her shelter was not fighting the storm, it was simply ignoring it. She was an island of calm in an ocean of chaos, her systems working in quiet harmony. She was warm, she was safe, and she was alive. In Providence Gulch, the world was breaking. The blizzard of '83, as it would later be known, was a catastrophe that conventional wisdom was not prepared for. The handsome, well-built houses with their large glass windows became ice boxes. The wind shattered panes of glass, letting the killing cold pour inside. Families huddled together, burning their furniture after their wood piles were buried under mountainous drifts. The roof of the town meeting hall, the pride of the community, groaned under the impossible weight of the snow, and then collapsed with a sound like thunder, splintering the massive beams that were supposed to last a century. Josiah's large, prosperous farmhouse, the very one he had taken from Alara, became a trap. The wind ripped shingles from the roof, and snow blew into the attic, melting and then refreezing, sealing them in. Their firewood, stacked neatly against the north wall, was gone, buried under a 20-foot drift. Inside, Josiah, his wife, and their young son huddled under every blanket they owned, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The boy, already suffering from a winter cough, grew worse, his breathing shallow and ragged. The town's confidence, its faith in its own sturdy, righteous construction, had shattered. They were isolated, freezing, and dying in the very homes that were meant to be their sanctuaries. On the third day of the storm, a figure stumbled through the white maelstrom. It was Brant, the trapper. His own small cabin, built in a clearing, had been crushed by a falling, snow-laden pine. He had survived only because he'd been thrown into the snow rather than pinned by the beams. For 2 days he had fought his way through the blizzard, disoriented and freezing. He knew his only chance was to follow the river, a landmark that could not be buried. He was on his last legs, his vision blurring, the frost biting deep into his hands and face, when he saw it, the faintest, most impossible thing. A thin, gray wisp of smoke, whipped instantly away by the wind, but undeniably there, rising from the snow-plastered cliff face. He clawed his way toward it, his mind refusing to believe what his eyes had seen. He fell and crawled, his body screaming in protest, until he collapsed against a wall of logs he could feel but not see. With the last of his strength he banged his frozen fist against the solid wood of Alara's door. The sound was so alien in her quiet world that Alara froze. It was impossible. Nothing could be alive out there. But it came again, a desperate, frantic pounding. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, unbarred the door, and cracked it open. The wind screamed into the opening, trying to force its way in. A figure, caked in snow and ice, fell forward into her home, collapsing onto the earthen floor. It was Brant. His face was a mask of ice and frostbite, his lips blue. He was barely conscious. She slammed the door shut against the storm and barred it, her heart pounding. For a moment she just stared at the man who had mocked her, who had called her a fool, now lying helpless at her feet. She remembered his smug laughter, his condescending words. A bitter, cold satisfaction flickered within her. This was justice. This was the world rendering its verdict on his arrogance. But the feeling died as quickly as it came. He was a human being, and he was dying on her floor. To let him perish would be to become as cruel as the world that had cast her out. That was not a victory. She knelt beside him. His breathing was shallow. She gently removed his frozen gloves, revealing hands that were waxy and white. Working quickly, she began to tend to him, using snow from just outside her door to slowly, carefully warm the frost-bitten flesh, the way her father had taught her. She wrapped him in her spare blanket and propped him near the fire, forcing sips of warm, sweet willow-bark tea between his cracked lips. Hours later, he regained full consciousness. His eyes fluttered open, and for a long moment he was utterly disoriented. He was warm. The air was still. He could hear the crackle of a fire and the soft clucking of chickens. He slowly pushed himself up on one elbow and looked around. The sight stunned him into silence. He was in a cave, yes, but it was not the primitive hole he had imagined. It was a home. A neat bed of pine boughs and blankets lay in one corner. A sturdy table and chair, crafted from riverwood, stood near the fire. On the table was a lit tallow lamp casting a steady golden glow. Along one wall was the massive, orderly stack of firewood. In an alcove, 3 healthy chickens roosted, pecking at scratch feed. He saw the small, miraculous garden box with green leaves thriving in the warmth of the hearth. He saw the cistern of clear water, a smooth, dark eye in the earth. It was a place of impossible warmth, order, and life, existing in the heart of a world that had frozen solid. He looked at Alara, who was stirring a pot over the fire. He looked at her scarred, capable hands. He thought of his own ruined cabin, of the frozen, desperate state of Providence Gulch. He had been so sure of his knowledge, of his strength, of the right way to live in this land. And he had been wrong. Utterly, fatally wrong. Fairbrother says a wave of shame washed over him, so powerful it was dizzying. His mockery, his arrogance, it all seemed like the braying of an ignorant child. "We were wrong," he croaked, his voice raw from the cold. "I called you a fool. My God, we were the fools." Alara did not turn from the fire. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not offer a single word of triumph. Her victory was not in his admission, but in the simple fact that she was here and able and alive. She ladled a thick, steaming broth into a wooden bowl and brought it to him. "There is food," she said, her voice even. "Eat. You need your strength." Her quiet grace was more humbling than any rebuke. He took the bowl, his hands shaking, and ate. As his strength returned, he told her of the town, of the collapsed hall, of the freezing families. He told her about Josiah, trapped and out of firewood, and his sick little boy. The stakes of Alara's moral choice grew. It was no longer about saving the man who had scorned her. It was about saving the community that had exiled her, including the very man who had engineered her downfall. She listened without comment. When he was finished, she stood up and began to bundle her warmest furs. She took a small, crude sled she had built for hauling firewood and began loading it with logs, dried food, and a precious bundle of her green vegetables. Brant stared at her, bewildered. "What are you doing?" "You said they have no wood," she replied, pulling on her heavy mittens. "I have wood." "You can't go out in that," he protested. "It's death out there." "People are already dying," she said. "We are not." She handed him a spare set of woolen wraps for his hands and face. "We have warmth to share. Let's go." The journey to Providence Gulch was a trek through a frozen hell. With Brant leading the way, they pushed the sled through drifts that were taller than they were, the wind, a constant screaming assault. But they were two now, and they were fueled by the warmth and food from her shelter. They reached the edge of town to find a scene of utter devastation. Houses were buried, their windows dark and vacant. An eerie silence hung over the place, the silence of a town that had given up. They went to Josiah's house first. They had to dig their way to the door. When Alara pushed it open, the cold that billowed out was as frigid as the air outside. The family was huddled together in one room, wrapped in every piece of fabric they owned. Josiah looked up, his face gaunt and gray with despair. When he saw Alara, framed in the doorway, a sled of firewood behind her, his face crumpled. The arrogance, the piety, the judgment, it all dissolved, leaving only the raw shame of a man who had been saved by the one he had wronged. He could not speak. He could not even meet her eyes. Ilara said nothing to him. She walked past him to where his son lay shivering, his breathing a painful rasp. She felt the boy's forehead, then unwrapped the bundle of greens and began to prepare a healing poultice, her movements calm and efficient. Brant started a fire in the hearth with the wood they had brought, and slowly, miraculously, warmth began to creep back into the frozen house. After the blizzard broke, the full scope of the town's failure became clear. The community's relationship with Ilara transformed overnight. The derisive nickname, the Cave Girl, was never spoken again. People came to her dugout, not with pity, but with a quiet, desperate reverence. They brought her goods to trade, a side of bacon, a bolt of cloth, a bag of nails, in exchange for her knowledge. They asked her how. How had she survived? How had she known? She showed them. She showed them how the earth itself could be a blanket. She explained the principle of thermal mass, of building into a southern-facing slope to catch the winter sun. She showed them how to find clay and mix it into a mortar that was cheaper and more insulating than anything they could buy. Her shelter became a school. The authority figure who had wronged her, Josiah, was diminished. He stepped down as a church elder, his moral authority shattered by his own hypocrisy and his rescue at the hands of his victim. He never spoke to Ilara directly, but he sent a wagon loaded with tools and supplies to her claim, an unspoken apology she accepted without comment. In the years that followed, Providence Gulch rebuilt, but it rebuilt differently. New homes were constructed with deep stone foundations, with at least one wall set back into the earth. The town that had once prized tall, impressive wooden structures now valued the humble, resilient wisdom of the earth. Ilara's story spread, carried by travelers and trappers, to other settlements in the mountains. The tale of the woman who had been banished to a worthless landslide and had built the warmest home in the territory became a regional legend. The landscape itself changed, dotted with homes that followed her principles, their wisping smoke a testament to her legacy. Ilara never moved back to town. Her dugout on the riverbank expanded, becoming a comfortable, rambling homestead, a testament to a life built not on what was given, but on what was created. Her farm was small but prosperous, her animals healthy, her larder always full. She became the quiet heart of the community, a woman sought out for her wisdom on everything from setting a broken bone to knowing when the first frost would fall. She had built more than a shelter. She had built a life on her own terms from the very materials the world had discarded. She had faced injustice not with anger, but with an axe and a shovel. She had answered mockery not with words, but with a warm hearth. Her ultimate vindication was not in the town's apology, but in the quiet peace of her own resilient existence. Sitting by her door on a cool autumn evening, watching the river flow as it always had, she understood that true strength was not about proving others wrong, but about the quiet, determined, and unending work of building something that lasts.